For today, we have the pleasure to welcome Professor Tom Sauer from Antwerp University, who will tell us on implications of the Trump presidency for Europe. Tom is professor in international politics at Antwerp University in Belgium. He has published 10 books and dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles, mostly on nuclear arms control, as well as more than 250 op-eds. He's on the board of Pax Christi Flanders and the Flemish Peace Institute. He is member of the scientific committee of the International Institute of Peace in Vienna, Austria, and he has been research fellow at Harvard University and received also Rotary Alumni Global Service Award. I hand over now to Tom for his presentation, and I stop sharing. Please, Tom.
Hi, everybody. I hope that you can hear me. So let's talk about the impact of the Trump presidency on Europe. And I will start with a couple of caveats. I have not encountered a person who can predict the future, so neither can I. Another caveat, Trump is highly unpredictable. So that does not make my job tonight any easier. And the last caveat, we should not always expect the worst. In this case, there are checks and balances inside the US political system that make that Trump's power will probably remain limited, although he will try to do away with some of these limitations by firing thousands of officials. Internationally, the United States is not the hegemon anymore that it was before. So that also puts a brake on what he could do in the rest of the world. Now, what is probably the most important for Trump is what he means when he promised America first and make America great again. To be clear, that's not unique to him or to the United States. President Xi of China also wants to make his country great again. And one of the major theories of international relations, realism, also starts from that assumption. But why are these mantras so important for him? Because he wants to please his base, the American people. That's my answer. Most politicians, of course, want to do that, but he fundamentally is a narcissist. A narcissist wants to be admired. And in this regard, he is extremely good in finding out what the ordinary American citizen wants. And that is not attacking countries on the other side of the globe, for whatever reason, so-called national interests or ideological reasons to impose democracy, or that is neither human rights abroad or at home, for instance, abortion rights. No, Trump is well aware that people care most about the economy. Stupid. They care about jobs, the American people, like most people. And they care about no or little inflation. And the irony is that the Biden administration did a rather good job in this regard. The US economy is doing relatively well. But Trump succeeded in creating the perception that American life became more expensive due to inflation years ago. And it's the perception that counts, not the reality. And that's the reason why he won the elections. Another reason why he won the elections is because Democrats were weak. Nobody knew for what Kamala Harris stood. Now, even the way Trump is planning to reach that goal of make America great again is not very unique. It's a business way of thinking, transactional, tit for tat, cooperation on the basis of reciprocity. So that's not very different from the other major theory of international relations, namely what we call liberalism, in the sense of cooperation between states. That said, I think Trump is more a realist than a liberalist in the sense that he does not believe in long-term structural cooperation between states. He only believes in short-term deals. And that's unique for him to a certain extent. This transactional way of thinking has three major consequences for global politics, including Europe. One, He does not care about major long-term problems such as climate change. He has no sense of morality or values. And if he wants to do something good, it's because he wants to be recognized for that. And in this way, getting the Nobel Peace Prize and getting into the history books because of his narcissistic characteristics. Two, another major consequence, the fact that he does not believe in long-term structural cooperation between states means that he does not like international organizations. Also because he feels constrained by these international organizations. And that also applies to NATO. I will come back to that later on. In short, American unilateralism instead of multilateralism will prevail in the coming years. And that's a major difference between the Trump and the Biden administration. Three, and last major consequence, and similar to the second point, he does not see the need for international treaties, international law. International treaties are regarded as something that constrains the United States. And that explains why he got rid of many treaties. In his first term, he unsigned the Paris Agreement with respect to the climate change. He unilaterally abandoned the INF Treaty, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, medium range missiles in Europe, with Russia. He withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty, that's about transparency and verification with respect to conventional arms control. And Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, if you remember. And by the way, the consequence is that Iran is now much closer to the bomb than ever, and certainly than in 2015, the time of the deal. And that's the consequence of what Trump did. So it's not very difficult to predict that he will continue withdrawing from treaties, as long as there are any treaties. Most have been gone, at least in the arms control sphere, and he will continue to make life difficult for international organizations and its member states, including the United Nations. And he won't be interested in long-term problems in the future either. So what are the implications for us Europeans? And I see three implications. First of all, the EU as an institution will see itself neglected by the Trump administration. Trump does not like the EU because of different reasons, because of the different reasons mentioned earlier. First of all, it's an IO, it's an international organization, and he does not like international organizations. And because it's easier for the United States to make deals with individual member states than with the EU, because they are less powerful, he believes. This stands in contrast to the Biden administration that took the EU institutions more serious, one of the first American administrations that did so. Secondly, economically speaking, Trump will play it hard. His favorite instruments are tariffs, and he wants to impose tariffs on goods coming from any other country with which the United States has a trade deficit. Although there's in principle nothing wrong with having a trade deficit. Now, all countries that are partly responsible for the United States trade deficit will feel it by increased tariffs on the goods that are exported to the United States. And the country that will be taxed most is probably China. By chance or not by chance, the biggest economic and political competitor for the United States. Trump, and he's not the only one in the United States, wants the United States to remain the number one in the world. Again, related to his narcissistic characteristic. But, and this is relevant for us allies, Trump is even planning to impose tariffs on European goods. So I'm curious how the EU will react. Christine Lagarde, the head of the European Central Bank, already proposed to buy more American goods, including defense equipment, in order to convince Trump not to impose tariffs on our goods. Now, I do not understand that. Just to please Trump because we are afraid of him? More fundamentally, most states in the world have a pragmatic realpolitik foreign policy. Most states in the world hedge, as we say, meaning that they look both to the west and to the east. And the best examples nowadays are Turkey and India, but also most of the states in the Far East and in the global south in general. So they look and deal with the West and with Russia and China, depending on the issue. Europe, the EU, is the only political constellation that I know that only and automatically always looks to the West, to the United States, and never to the East. I think by definition, that's not very smart from the part of view of the EU. That's my own view. Thirdly, and more importantly, Trump's way of thinking will probably have most influence on NATO. As already stated, he does not like to be constrained by international organizations, and that also applies to NATO. On the other hand, the United States receives many benefits from NATO, including many European military bases that the United States can use to operate in the rest of the world. Apparently, Trump really wanted to withdraw from NATO during his first term, but his advisors were able to convince him from the opposite. This time around, his advisors may be less moderate, but still, the odds are that the United States will not withdraw from NATO. That's at least my guess. That said, he may threaten to do so in order to oblige Europe to spend more on defense and to buy more arms, not in Europe, but from the United States defense industry. And that strategy worked already in his first term. And since the start of the war in Ukraine in 2022, many European states increased their defense spending even more. So the European NATO member states increased their spending in absolute numbers from $280 billion 5 years ago to $480 billion per year nowadays. So that means that the European NATO member states spent more than $200 billion more per year on defense than 5 years ago. That's a lot of money, $200 billion. And that number is increasing by the day. In percentage of GDP, most NATO member states are now spending 2%. But the idea is to go to 2.5% or maybe even 3% in the future. And as a presidential candidate, Trump already has said that those states that do not fulfill their obligations will not be protected by the United States. So I ask myself the question, is all that in our European interests? When will we Europeans stop being dependent on the United States for our own security? In other words, when will we start getting rid of NATO? At least as it exists now as a collective defense organization. And let me sum up my 3 major grievances with respect to NATO. First, NATO is an alliance, a collective defense organization, which is meant to protect its members against an attack from outside. Now, in times of war or in times of grave threats, an alliance may be useful, and certainly for smaller states like my own, Belgium. And one could argue that we live now in such times. But alliances are supposed to be disbanded in times of peace, for the simple reason that there is no external enemy in times of peace. It's therefore normal that the alliances of the First World War were disbanded after the First World War, and those of the Second World War were disbanded after the Second World War, and that the Warsaw Pact, the counterpart of NATO, was disbanded after the Cold War. Now, what is striking and bizarre is that NATO continued to exist in the 1990s and beyond. And that's an aberration in world history. It's very hard to explain, certainly from a realist point of view. And it's not only bizarre that NATO continued to exist, it is also perverse, because NATO then had to find another enemy in order to legitimize its own existence. Of course, if you put on your dark sunglasses, you will find another enemy if you look very carefully. And if you wait long enough, the old enemy becomes the new enemy, Russia. But again, I find it perverse. It is as if we are addicted to conflicts and arms races, or better, that NATO is addicted to conflicts and arms races, and that there's no better alternative. But there is an alternative. There are other kinds of international organizations, international security organizations, that fit better in times of peace. Yeah? That also may prevent wars better, namely collective security organizations, which are different from collective defense organizations. These collective security organizations want to preserve peace and security amongst its members by making rules about war and peace, by trust building, by creating a we feeling, but not against an external enemy. So that's much more constructive and sustainable in turn than a pure alliance. And examples of collective security organizations are the United Nations, for instance, which is a global collective security organization, and the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that includes the United States, Europe, and Russia. Now, many will argue that the OSCE is weak. Now, my answer is that as long as the OSCE has to live besides NATO, it will always remain weak. But take NATO away and the OSCE will probably blossom. Second major grievance with respect to NATO, alliances without an enemy have to create roles for which they were not established. I'm thinking about NATO in the 1990s. In the case of NATO after the Cold War, when Russia was officially a partner, it had to find another mission than collective defense. And that mission became intervening militarily around the world, military interventions, beyond the North Atlantic region, going to Afghanistan, to Libya, etc. By the way, it was said it was out of area or out of business for NATO at that time. Three military interventions, apart from the former Yugoslavia, were an absolute failure. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, mostly by the United States, leading to individual traumas that will haunt the West for decades. Children growing up and becoming terrorists in 20 years' time. That's another reason why I do not like alliances or collective defense organizations. Certainly not if they behave like the policemen of the world without any legitimacy. And the third and last reason why I do not like NATO, more in particular, is the asymmetrical power situation within the organization. Namely, the fact that the United States is the number one by far inside NATO, also because it spends most on defense, and where we Europeans are weaker, and as a result can be pushed by the Americans to do things that are in the interest of the United States, but not in our own interest. And that's of course crazy. The best example is what happened at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, when the United States wanted to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, the fourth or fifth round of NATO expansion, you remember? And we Europeans were against that idea. Merkel was against, Sarkozy was against, because they knew that it would lead to problems with Russia, which is our neighbor, not the United States' neighbor. But President Bush Jr. kept pushing until we Europeans agreed. And the end result was a bad compromise for everybody, especially for Ukraine, but also for Europe, namely the promise that Georgia and Ukraine, and I quote, will become member, end of quote, of NATO, although without setting a deadline. So the big red line was crossed for Russia, and Putin was very angry. And it was followed by the war in Georgia a few weeks or months later, as a reaction, and the war in Ukraine a few years later, 2014. And that war comes now back like a boomerang in our face, in our European face. The refugees are in Europe, not in the United States. The inflation was high in Europe, less so in the United States. And the United States is making money out of this war in Ukraine. We Europeans bought already for $100 billion weapons in the United States for Ukraine. Good for American jobs, not European jobs. And we bought cheap Russian gas before the war, which is perfectly normal. Now we buy more expensive gas in the United States. That is also more polluted, shale gas. And last but not least, the United States and Trump, even more than Biden, are already saying that we Europeans will have to manage the post-war situation in Ukraine. So we will have to resolve it, to send peacekeeping troops and to spend hundreds of billions for reconstruction and rebuilding Ukraine. Hello. We Europeans are simply fooled by the Americans. Twice. Huh? And I'm the only academic in my country that is willing to speak out. I do not understand that. Now, for all these reasons, I believe that once the war is over, we should get rid of NATO, at least as a collective defense organization. At least if Trump did not abolish NATO before we would do it. The alternative for NATO is replacing it by a combination of the EU and the OSCE. The OSCE I have already explained, so let me finish with the EU. The EU is the most integrated international organization in the world. Its member states even give up their currencies, or at least some of them, and we now pay in euros, or at least many of us. The EU is an example of step-by-step integration. And the most logical is that the integration will not stop, that it will continue. Also according to theories of political integration, especially functionalism, neo-functionalism, and certainly federalism. At a certain moment, regardless of Trump, it would be logical to ask the question whether we will make a political union after a monetary union and an economic union. A political union, a federal Europe that includes a real common foreign security policy and a European army. We have already taken steps in the direction of common and foreign security policy and defense integration, but we are not there yet. One question is about the sequencing. First a political union and then a defense union, or the other way around? Question mark. Politically speaking, it may be more easy to push further on defense integration. Both the elite and public opinion, certainly now in times of war, seem to a certain extent prepared for that. And certainly now with Trump and a more isolationist United States. On the other hand, it would be more logical to have a political union first and then a defense union. Because who is going to control the military without a political union? So that's a matter of democracy and good governance. Many other questions pop up with respect to European defense integration. Let me bring up three, and then I will close my lecture. First one is money. Most advocates of an European defense union believe that it will require more money going to defense. I'm not sure, but I think it is our role to warn not to copy the military-industrial complex of the United States here in Europe. Of course, those in favor of an European defense union are most of the times also in favor of spending more on defense and use/misuse the argument of European defense integration for spending more on defense. Now, the EU member states, so therefore not including the United Kingdom, Norway, or Turkey, nowadays spend, I believe, $330 billion on defense per year. China is spending 300 and Russia 120. In addition to that, the European Commission is planning to spend 400 to 500 billion euro the next 6 years on defense. That means an additional 50 billion euro per year, especially in support for the defense industry in Europe. So it's correct that China can buy more material with $300 billion than we can do, but still, in my view, we Europeans should not spend more on defense, but spend it better. By how? By pooling and sharing, by specializing. Each of our national armies should not preserve a navy, an air force, and a land army. We in Europe have many more types of tanks, aircraft, artillery, munitions than the United States. That's not efficient. If we're going to have a political union, we could specialize. That's much more efficient. By the way, an European political union means having a system that resembles a kind of alliance, but this time it's just one country. Now, I understand that we are not there yet, political union, federal Europe, also because most politicians and public opinion do not want a federal Europe or a political union yet. Which brings me to probably the biggest problem. The second one of my list, we Europeans are divided fundamentally divided on these issues. Most newcomers read the East and Central Europeans, as well as those in the North, Scandinavian countries, prefer the United States and therefore NATO for our European defense. It's basically only the French and some Germans and some Belgians and maybe a few Italians who want a European defense union with a European army. And the others do not trust the French. So it's also a problem of path dependency. It's much easier to keep something that exists, NATO, than establishing something new from scratch. And on top of these deep divisions, the tandem that is supposed to be the heart of European integration is the couple France-Germany. Now, nowadays, not only the two presidents, Macron and Scholz, do not form a good couple on a personal basis, but both countries are economically and politically in a mess for the moment. So it will be very, very difficult to make more progress on integration. And there are, of course, many more questions that will pop up with respect to an European Defence Union. A last problem, and I finish with that, is the question whether we need a so-called Eurobomb, a European nuclear deterrent. Personally, I'm against, but in case Trump withdraws all American troops and all American tactical nuclear weapons from Europe, which is unlikely, but you never know with Trump, that question will certainly pop up again. And on this, there's no consensus either. We are divided on that as well. So as a result, I'm afraid that there won't be many changes because of these divisions amongst ourselves in Europe, at least not from the European side on the ocean of the Atlantic Ocean. NATO will remain into existence for a long time, I'm afraid, except if Trump radically alters the course of history. But if he does not do that, we will and have to live with the surprises by Trump inside NATO. And here I will end my introduction.
Thanks very much, Tom, for this very interesting and for me also very positive point of view, because it opened at least possibilities where something new and perhaps something positive could happen out of all the disaster. Before we start the discussion, I stop recording so that we can then freely talk and discuss.